He was a cattle baron with 1,000 acres of dust, 15 hungry ranch hands, and a cook who made stew that even the coyotes would spit out. His name was Thorne McCrae, and his life was as hard and cracked as the Texas land he ruled. He posted a notice in the nearest town, Yellowhorn. It was simple, direct, and hopeless. Cook wanted. Room and board provided. Apply in person. He figured he'd get some grizzled old prospector who'd lost his claim, or maybe a drifter running from the law. He never expected her. He never expected the woman who walked up his drive a week later, looking like a ghost shimmering in the heat. She was small, her dress was faded to the color of the sky, and she was holding a newborn baby wrapped in a tattered linen cloth. She looked like she'd break if the wind blew too hard. But her eyes were a different story. They were steady, green, and held a fire that the sun hadn't been able to bake out of her. "I saw your notice," she said, her voice quiet but clear over the wind. "I can cook. I need a place to stay." Thorne just stared. A woman with a baby, out here in the middle of nowhere. It was a death sentence. "You walked here?" he finally managed to ask, his own voice sounding rough as gravel. "Wagon lost a wheel at the fork," she said, shifting the infant on her hip. "It's just me and him now. Name's Juniper Rose." The men had gathered behind Thorne, whispering and staring. A woman was a rare enough sight. A woman with a baby was like a creature from another world. He should have said no. Every logical part of his brain screamed at him to send her away. She was a complication, a weakness. This was a place of hard men and harder work. But then he looked at the baby, a tiny, sleeping thing, and then back at her eyes. There was no plea in them, no desperation. Just a simple, unbreakable statement of fact. She was here. She could cook. She needed a place. "I don't ask for wages," she added, as if reading his mind. "Just a roof and food for me and my son." He could feel the eyes of his men on his back. He knew what they were thinking. But something else was at work. Something he hadn't felt since he buried his wife, Clara, 2 years ago. A flicker of something. "You cook tonight," he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "If the men don't riot, you can stay." She just nodded once. "That's fair." As she walked past him toward the sorry excuse for a kitchen, he caught the scent of dust and sweat and something else. Something like wild mint. He'd posted a notice for a cook, but he had a sinking feeling that what had just walked into his life was a whole lot more complicated, and he had no idea how right he was. The kitchen was more of a shed than a room, with a smoky hearth and shelves as bare as a sinner's soul. Juniper set her baby, who she called Sonny, down in a wooden crate she'd padded with flour sacks. The men watched her from the doorway of the mess hall, their arms crossed, their faces grim with skepticism. They were expecting the worst. Wade Kellerman, the oldest of the hands, was already sharpening his knife on his boot, ready to carve into another plate of leathery beef. But the smells that started drifting out of that kitchen weren't the usual smells of burnt beans and boiled boot leather. It was the smell of onions caramelizing, of smoked pork crisping in a pan, of cornbread rising sweet and golden. When she finally called them in, the table was loaded. There was a stew so rich and dark it looked like it had been simmering for days, not hours. The cornbread was still warm, with fresh butter melting into it. The beans tasted of smoke and spice. The men ate in a stunned, suspicious silence. Eli, a burly cowhand who complained about everything, took a bite of the stew, chewed slowly, and then slammed his fist on the table. Everyone froze. "What in the hell is this?" he bellowed, pointing his spoon at his bowl. Juniper, who was quietly wiping down the counter, just looked at him. "Dinner," she said. Eli stared at her, then back at his bowl. He took another bite, and another. "Tastes like something I paid a whole dollar for in San Antonio," he mumbled, and then he didn't say another word until his plate was wiped clean. One by one, the other men followed suit. The scraping of spoons against bowls was the only sound in the room. Thorne stood in the doorway, watching it all. He watched how she moved, efficient and quiet, a ghost in her own kitchen. He watched how she'd pause her stirring to gently rock the baby's crate with her foot. She hadn't asked for a single thing, hadn't complained about the lack of supplies or the broken stove door. She had simply taken the nothing he had and turned it into this. Later that night, long after the men were asleep, Thorne saw a light still on in the kitchen. He walked over, his boots silent in the dust. Through the grimy window, he saw her. She was on her knees in front of the hearth, stoking the embers. The baby was asleep on a pile of sacks nearby. The air was getting cold, but she was just in her thin dress, her bare feet on the cold stone. She seemed to be humming a tune so soft he couldn't quite hear it. Then she did something strange. She pulled a small dented tin from her satchel. From it, she took a pinch of dried leaves and dropped them into a kettle of water she'd set by the fire. A few moments later, the scent of sharp, clean peppermint drifted out into the night. It was the smell he'd noticed when she first arrived. She poured the steaming liquid into a clay mug, set it on a small wooden tray, and turned toward the door. Thorne stepped back into the shadows just as she opened it. Their eyes met in the moonlight. For a second, neither of them moved. "You've been coughing," she said softly. Her voice was different now, without the hard edge of a survivor. It was gentle. The dry air. This might help. She held the tray out to him. He didn't take it. He just stared at her. This enigma of a woman. A drifter who could cook like a chef from a fancy hotel. A single mother who carried herself like a queen. And a healer who noticed a man's cough in the dead of night. He gave a single sharp nod. That was all. She understood. She placed the tray on the porch railing beside the door and slipped back inside, closing it gently behind her. Thorne waited until the light in the window went out. Then he picked up the mug. The tea was hot and strong, and it soothed the raw scrape in his throat. He drank it all, standing there alone in the dark, under a blanket of stars that suddenly didn't feel so cold and empty. The next morning, when Juniper came into the kitchen, the mug was washed and sitting upside down on the counter, right where she'd left it. She saw it, and for the first time since she'd arrived, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She thought she was just building a fire to keep warm, but she had no idea what she'd truly ignited. A few weeks turned into a month. The ranch hands stopped calling her the cook and started calling her Miss Juniper. They took off their hats when she passed, and more than one of them got a sharp elbow from Wade for cursing too loud near the baby. The McCrae Ranch was still a hard place, but it was no longer a miserable one. The food was good, the nights were quieter, and there was a sense of something new in the air. Something that felt dangerously like hope. Thorne noticed other things too. Small, impossible things. Behind the tack shed, in a patch of dirt where only weeds and stones had ever been, a garden was growing. He saw it one morning and stopped dead in his tracks. There were 3 neat rows of green shoots pushing their way out of the dry soil. He crouched down. He recognized the mint, its leaves already fragrant in the morning sun. But there were other plants he'd never seen before. One had delicate star-shaped flowers. Another had broad dark leaves that looked like they belonged in a forest, not a desert. He saw a small wooden marker with a single word burned into it. Boneset. "They don't take up much room." Juniper's voice came from behind him. She was carrying Sunny on her hip, a basket of laundry in her other hand. She didn't look apologetic. She looked defiant. "I didn't say a word," Thorne replied, standing up. "You were thinking it," she said, a hint of a challenge in her eyes. "You're more than just a cook, aren't you?" It wasn't really a question. She just gave him a long, unreadable look. "I'm a survivor," she said, and walked away. The full meaning of that word became terrifyingly clear a week later. A young hand named Caleb, barely a boy, came stumbling out of the pastures, his face the color of ash. He collapsed by the water trough, vomiting and convulsing. Panic erupted. The men shouted and swore, useless in the face of whatever poison the boy had ingested. Thorne yelled for someone to ride for the doctor in Yellowhorn, a 2-hour ride at best. The boy would be dead by then. But then Juniper was there. She moved through the chaos like a calm wind, her face set and serious. She handed Sunny to Thorne without a word, and he took the baby instinctively, his mind reeling. And then she knelt by Caleb's side. She felt his pulse, lifted his eyelid, and then leaned in to smell his breath. "Cattle sage," she said, her voice sharp and certain. "He's eaten the poison berries." "Is he dying?" Wade asked, his voice trembling. Not if I can help it, she snapped. She ran to her little garden, pulling up roots and leaves with practiced hands. In the kitchen, she worked with a terrifying speed, crushing, boiling, mixing. She emerged with a dark, foul-smelling liquid in a cup. While Thorne and Wade held the convulsing boy down, she pried his jaw open and forced the remedy down his throat. Drop by agonizing drop. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. The men stood around, helpless, some of them praying under their breath. Then slowly Caleb's convulsions began to subside. His breathing, which had been ragged and shallow, grew deeper. By morning he was sitting up, pale and weak, but alive. He was alive. That evening the ranch was silent. The men looked at Juniper with a new kind of awe, mixed with a little bit of fear. She wasn't just a cook. She wasn't just a gardener. She was something else entirely. Thorne found her on the porch, rocking Sunny, who was cooing softly in her arms. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. My grandmother taught me, she said, without him even asking. She knew what the land gives, what heals and what harms. She taught you well, Thorne said, his voice low. You saved that boy's life. Juniper looked out at the vast, empty horizon. She taught me how to survive. It's all I've ever known. He wanted to ask her more. He wanted to ask what she was surviving from. Who was she running from? Why was a woman with her skills and knowledge living on the run with a baby? But he didn't. He just stood there beside her, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. He was beginning to realize that Juniper Rose was a woman made of secrets, and he wasn't sure he was ready to uncover them, because he had a dark feeling that her secrets were a lot more dangerous than a patch of poison berries. And down the road in the smoky saloon in Yellowhorn, a man was asking questions. A man with cold eyes and a fancy suit who didn't belong in this part of Texas. He was asking if anyone had seen a woman with green eyes and dark hair, traveling alone with a newborn baby. He was offering a reward, a very, very large reward. The quiet rhythm of the ranch had changed. It wasn't just the food or the lack of fistfights in the bunkhouse. It was something deeper. Thorne found himself fixing things he let rot for years. He repaired the crooked door on the kitchen shed, replaced a cracked window pane, and even sanded down the splintered porch step she used every morning. He never said a word about it, and she never said a word of thanks. But every morning there was a cup of hot coffee waiting for him on the railing, just the way he liked it. It was a silent conversation, a language of actions that spoke louder than words ever could. He was starting to feel things he thought were long dead and buried with Clara. One night, a fierce wind kicked up, rattling the windows and howling like a banshee. Thorne couldn't sleep. He ended up in the barn, the one place that felt like his own. He pulled out the old guitar he hadn't touched since the funeral. It was dusty, and a string was broken, but he held it anyway. His fingers found the old chords, clumsy and hesitant. He was trying to pick out a melody, a simple, sad song Clara used to love, when he heard a noise. Juniper was standing in the barn doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders. He stopped playing, feeling like a boy caught stealing cookies. Don't stop, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the wind. She came and sat on a hay bale near him. It's beautiful. It's just an old song, he mumbled, embarrassed. Clara, my wife, she liked it. It was the first time he had said her name to Juniper. Music isn't a sin, Thorne, she said, her green eyes seeming to see right through him in the dim lantern light. Living without it is. He looked at her then, really looked at her, at the strength in her face, the kindness in her eyes, the sheer stubborn will that had carried her and her baby across a hostile country to his doorstep. He didn't know why, but he started talking. He told her about Clara, about the laughter that had filled this ranch, about the silence that had swallowed it whole after she was gone. He didn't realize he was crying until she reached out and gently wiped a tear from his cheek with her thumb. Her touch was light as a feather, but it sent a jolt through him that was stronger than lightning. But their quiet moment was shattered by a sudden, frantic shout from the yard. It was Wade. Thorne, get out here! It's the cattle! They ran outside into the howling wind. In the corral under the moonlight, the scene was a nightmare. 3 of his best steers were down, their bodies contorted. Others were stumbling, foam frothing from their mouths. Their eyes were wide with panic and pain. "What is it?" Thorn yelled over the wind. "I don't know," Wade shouted back. "They just started dropping." But Juniper knew. She was already at the fence line, her face pale in the lantern light. She knelt in the mud, examining one of the fallen animals. "It's not a sickness," she said, her voice grim. "It's the water." She ran to the main well, the one that fed all the troughs. She dipped a bucket, brought it up, and sniffed. Her face went rigid. "Spurge laurel," she whispered, her eyes wide with something that looked like terror. "It's a poison. Odorless. Tasteless. Someone did this on purpose." Thorn's blood ran cold. This wasn't a random sickness from a wild plant. This was an attack. Someone was trying to ruin him, to wipe out his entire herd. And as he looked at Juniper's terrified face, a horrifying thought struck him. The poison she named, Spurge laurel. It was a rare, cultivated plant. It didn't grow wild in Texas. It was something an apothecary would use. Someone with specialized knowledge. Someone like her. A dark, ugly suspicion began to creep into his mind. Who was this woman, really? Where did she come from? And was it just a coincidence that his cattle started dying right after she showed up, with her mysterious garden and her knowledge of strange and deadly plants? The wind howled around them, and for the first time, Thorn looked at Juniper Rose, not with budding affection, but with cold, hard suspicion. Had he let a viper into his home? The doubt was a poison in his own mind. He watched her every move as she worked feverishly to save his herd. She didn't sleep for 2 days. She sent the men into the woods to gather specific barks and roots, things Thorn had never even heard of. She turned the kitchen into an apothecary's workshop, with pots bubbling and strange, earthy smells filling the air. She mixed a thick, dark paste and, with Thorn holding the sick animals' heads, she forced the antidote down their throats herself, her arms covered in mud and animal slobber. She never stopped, never complained. She just worked, her face a mask of grim determination. He wanted to trust her. He saw the genuine panic in her eyes, the exhaustion that was making her sway on her feet. But the question remained, how did she know so much? How did she instantly recognize a rare, cultivated poison? The answer, when it came, wasn't from her. It came from Wade. The old ranch hand pulled Thorn aside, his face ashen. "Boss," he said, his voice low. "You remember Silas Croft? The fella who tried to buy you out last year? The one who wants your water rights?" Thorn remembered. Croft was a ruthless land baron who owned the neighboring territory. He was known for his predatory tactics. "What about him?" Thorn growled. "I saw one of his men riding away from our well 2 nights ago," Wade confessed, looking ashamed. "I thought he was just lost. Didn't think nothing of it. But now," the pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. It was Croft. He was trying to force Thorn to sell by destroying his livelihood. The relief that washed over Thorn was so intense, it almost brought him to his knees. It wasn't Juniper. She wasn't poisoning him. She was saving him. He had doubted her. He had looked at her with suspicion when she was fighting to save the very heart of his world. The shame felt like a physical weight. He went to find her. She was in the barn, collapsed onto a pile of hay, covered in grime, fast asleep from sheer exhaustion. Baby Sonny was sleeping peacefully in his crate beside her. The last of the sick cattle were on their feet, looking weak but alive. She had done it. She had saved them. He stood there for a long time, just looking at her, this impossible woman. He thought about what he had almost lost. Not just his cattle, but his faith. He thought about the cold, empty silence that had been his life for 2 years, and how she had filled it with the smell of baking bread, the sound of a baby's laughter, and the quiet strength of her presence. He knelt beside her, his movements clumsy. He didn't know what to do, what to say, so he did the only thing that felt right. He gently reached out and brushed a stray piece of hair from her face. His fingers grazed her cheek. It was the first time he had willingly touched another person since Clara's death. She stirred, her green eyes fluttering open. They were cloudy with sleep, and for a moment she looked vulnerable, lost. Then she saw him, and a flicker of fear crossed her face. The same fear she'd had when she realized the well was poisoned. She was still afraid. Not of Croft, but of something else. Something from her past. "Thorn," she whispered. "It's okay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it. You saved them." He didn't move his hand. He just left it there, his thumb resting gently on her cheek. "I'm sorry," he said, the words barely audible. "I'm sorry I ever doubted you." A tear welled up in her eye and rolled down her dusty cheek. She didn't say anything. She just closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, a silent acceptance that was more powerful than any words. In the quiet of that barn, surrounded by the slow breathing of the recovering herd, something shifted between them. The wall he had built around his heart didn't just crack, it shattered, but their newfound peace was about to be destroyed. Because back in Yellowhorn, the man in the fancy suit had finally found someone who recognized the woman in his sketch, an old prospector who'd seen Juniper on the road. The man smiled, a cold, predatory smile. He tossed a heavy gold coin to the prospector and walked out of the saloon. He and his men weren't bounty hunters. They were Pinkerton agents. And the woman they knew as Eleanor Vance wasn't just a runaway. She was a fugitive wanted for theft and murder. The news from the Pinkerton agents hit Thorne like a physical blow. Wade had overheard them in town, boasting about closing in on a murderess hiding out at a local ranch. A woman with dark hair, green eyes, and a baby. A woman named Eleanor Vance. He rode back to the ranch like a madman, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and betrayal. Murder? It didn't make sense. The gentle woman who healed his cattle, who cared for his men, who had brought life back into his desolate home. A killer. He confronted her in the kitchen. He didn't yell. His voice was cold. Dead. "Your name is Eleanor Vance." It wasn't a question. Her face went bone white. The wooden spoon she was holding clattered to the floor. She backed away from him, her eyes wide with the familiar terror he was beginning to recognize. The terror of a cornered animal. "Who told you that?" she whispered. "It doesn't matter," he said, his heart feeling like a block of ice in his chest. "Is it true? Are you wanted for murder?" She started to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. She shook her head frantically. "No, it's not what you think. It's all a lie." And then the story came tumbling out, a torrent of secrets and pain that left him speechless. Her real name was Eleanor Vance. She was the daughter of a wealthy industrialist in Philadelphia, a man who was more of a monster than a father. He had arranged a marriage for her to a cruel business partner, a man twice her age. Eleanor had fallen in love with a stable hand, a kind young man named Sam. Sonny was his son. When her father found out, he was enraged. He had Sam arrested on trumped-up charges of theft. Sam was beaten in his cell and died of his injuries before he could even face a judge. Her father had murdered the man she loved. Then to control her, he had accused her of conspiring with Sam to steal family heirlooms. He painted her as a greedy, manipulative woman who had driven her lover to crime. He had her declared mentally unstable, a prisoner in her own home. She knew she had to escape, not just for herself, but for her unborn child. With the help of a sympathetic maid, she faked her own death by drowning and fled west, taking on the name Juniper Rose, hoping to disappear forever. Thorne listened, his anger and suspicion slowly melting away, replaced by a wave of protective fury so powerful it took his breath away. She wasn't a killer. She was a survivor. She had been through a hell he could barely imagine. He looked at her, trembling before him, and he saw not a fugitive, but the bravest woman he had ever met. "They're coming for you," he said, his voice no longer cold, but filled with a grim resolve. "They think you're here alone." She looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes searching his. "I am alone," she whispered. He stepped forward and closed the distance between them. He gently took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "No," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he couldn't name. "You're not." At that exact moment, the ranch dogs started barking, a frantic, savage sound. Thorne looked out the window. 4 riders were coming up the drive, moving fast. They weren't cowboys. They were dressed in dark coats, and the sun glinted off the rifles in their hands. The Pinkertons. They were here. Get Sonny, Thorne said, his voice deadly calm as he reached for the shotgun he kept mounted over the fireplace. Stay in the back of the house and don't make a sound. She didn't argue. She scooped up the baby and ran, her face a mask of pure terror. Thorne checked the shells in the shotgun, his hands steady. He had spent 2 years letting his ranch, his life, and his heart wither and die. But no more. These men were not just coming for Eleanor Vance. They were coming for Juniper Rose. They were coming for his Juniper. And they were about to find out what happens when you try to take something from a man who has nothing left to lose. The lead Pinkerton, a man with a sneer permanently etched on his face, dismounted and strode onto the porch as if he owned it. We're looking for a woman, he said, not even bothering with a greeting. Eleanor Vance. We have a warrant for her arrest. Thorne stood in the doorway, the shotgun held loosely at his side. Never heard of her, he said, his voice flat. There's no one here but me and my men. The agent chuckled, a nasty grating sound. Don't play dumb with me, rancher. We know she's here, hiding under the name Juniper Rose. Send her out now and we'll make this easy. I'll say it one more time, Thorne said, his knuckles turning white as he tightened his grip on the shotgun. There's no one here by that name. Now get off my land. The agent's smile vanished. Have it your way. He motioned to his men, who began to spread out, rifles ready. They were planning to storm the house, but they hadn't counted on the ranch hands. Wade, Eli, and a dozen other men seemed to materialize out of thin air, appearing from the barn, the bunkhouse, the stables. They were armed with hunting rifles, pistols, even pitchforks. They formed a silent, grim line behind Thorne. They weren't just his employees anymore. They were his army. The Pinkerton agent hesitated, his eyes darting from face to face. This wasn't the easy job he'd been promised. This was a hornet's nest. This is official business, he shouted, trying to regain control. You're obstructing justice. You ain't got no justice here, Wade growled, cocking his rifle. This is McCrae land, and you ain't welcome. For a tense minute, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind and the nervous shifting of the horses. Then from inside the house came the cry of a baby. It was a tiny sound, but in the dead silence, it was as loud as a cannon shot. The lead agent's eyes lit up with triumph. There she is, he sneered. Last chance, McCrae. Give her up. But it wasn't Thorne who answered. It was Juniper. The back door creaked open, and she stepped out, holding Sonny tightly to her chest. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing. You want me? She called out, her voice ringing with a strength no one knew she possessed. Here I am, but you will not take my son. She started walking, not towards the agents, but towards the barn. It was a desperate, foolish move. The agents raised their rifles, ready to corner her. Thorne screamed her name, but she kept walking, her back straight, her head held high. What happened next was a blur of chaos. As the agents moved to intercept her, a new threat emerged from the other side of the property. Silas Croft and 5 of his own men came riding over the ridge, guns drawn. They weren't here to help. Croft had seen the Pinkertons ride in and had decided to use the chaos to his advantage. He wanted Thorne dead and his land claimed. Looks like you've got your hands full, McCrae, Croft yelled, a wicked grin on his face as he fired a shot into the air. The ranch was now a war zone, caught between 2 sets of enemies. The Pinkertons were focused on Juniper, while Croft's men charged towards Thorne and the ranch hands. Gunshots erupted from all sides. It was a maelstrom of bullets, smoke, and shouting. In the middle of it all was Juniper, clutching her baby, trying to get to the relative safety of the barn. The lead Pinkerton saw his chance. While everyone was distracted, he broke off and galloped after her. He cornered her against the barn wall, his horse rearing. He reached down, grabbing for the baby. Give me the boy, he snarled. He's evidence, Juniper screamed, a raw, primal sound of a mother protecting her child. She twisted away, but he was too strong. His fingers closed around Sonny's blanket. And then Thorne was there. He appeared as if from nowhere, tackling the agent off his horse. The 2 men hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt, a desperate, brutal tangle of fists and fury. Thorne was fighting with a ferocity he didn't know he had, fueled by rage and a terror-filled love for the woman and child who had become his world. He landed a solid punch to the agent's jaw, stunning him. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing his shotgun. But as he turned, he saw Silas Croft, a clear shot, his pistol aimed not at Thorne, but at Juniper, who was huddled on the ground, shielding Sonny with her body. Croft smiled. "The woman dies first," he said. Time seemed to slow down. Thorne knew he couldn't raise his shotgun fast enough. It was over. But then, a single shot rang out, clean and true, from the roof of the bunkhouse. Silas Croft's eyes went wide with surprise. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He staggered backward, his pistol falling from his hand, and collapsed into the dust. Everyone froze. All eyes turned to the bunkhouse roof. Standing there, a smoking rifle in his hands, was Caleb, the young boy Juniper had saved from the poison berries. He had returned the favor. The fight was over. The remaining Pinkertons and Croft's men, seeing their leaders taken down, lost their nerve and fled. In the sudden, ringing silence, Thorne ran to Juniper. He knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he helped her up. "Are you okay? Is Sonny okay?" he asked, his voice choked with relief. She just nodded, unable to speak, her body trembling uncontrollably as she clutched her son. He pulled them both into his arms, holding them tight against his chest, shielding them from the world. He could feel her heart hammering against his, a frantic, desperate rhythm that matched his own. The danger had passed. They had survived. But as he held her, he knew this wasn't the end. Her father was still out there, a powerful, ruthless man who would never stop looking for her. They had won the battle, but the war for their life and their future had only just begun. In the aftermath, a strange calm settled over the McCrae Ranch. They buried Silas Croft in an unmarked grave on the edge of his own property, a quiet and final justice. Thorne sent a message back with the captured lead Pinkerton agent, a man now missing a few teeth and all of his pride. The message was simple. "Eleanor Vance is dead. Her name is Juniper McCrae now. This is her home. If you ever send anyone to Texas again, they won't be coming back." It was a bluff, a gamble against a man with limitless money and power, but it was all they had. For weeks they lived on a knife's edge, waiting. Every cloud of dust on the horizon sent a jolt of fear through them, but no one came. The days turned into a month, and the fear slowly began to fade, replaced by the familiar rhythms of ranch life. But everything was different. The space between Thorne and Juniper was now charged with unspoken words, with the memory of shared terror and the fierce, undeniable bond that had been forged in the crucible of that gunfight. He started building. One morning, Juniper woke to the sound of a hammer. Thorne was outside the kitchen in the early morning light, framing a new room, a proper room with a real window and a sturdy door. It was an extension of the main house, connecting her world to his. "You're not asking me to leave when spring ends," she said, her voice soft. He stopped hammering and looked at her, his eyes serious. "I'm asking you to plant things that will need the summer to grow," he replied. It wasn't a proposal, not really. It was something more, a promise, a statement of fact. "You belong here, with me." That night he took out the old guitar again. He sat on the porch steps under the stars and played the song Clara had loved. But it wasn't a sad song anymore. It was a song of remembrance, of gratitude for what was, and of hope for what could be. Juniper came and sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. Sonny slept peacefully inside, safe in his cradle. "I came here begging for a place to stay," she whispered into the darkness. He stopped playing and turned to her. He rested his forehead against hers. "And now I'm begging you to never leave," he said. "Be my home, Juniper." Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." They were married 3 days later, not by a preacher, but by the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel over the ranch. The men strung lanterns from the fence posts, and Eli roasted a whole hog. Caleb, the hero of the shootout, played a lopsided but joyful tune on his harmonica. Juniper wore a simple dress the color of her mint leaves, and Sonny wore a crown of wildflowers. Thorne didn't have a ring, so he gave her a small, smooth river stone he had carried in his pocket since he was a boy. a symbol of permanence, of something that could withstand the harshest storms. It was more precious than any diamond. In the weeks that followed, a transformation took place. Thorne, using the money he'd saved and the new profits from a healthy herd, began buying up parcels of Croft's old land. But he wasn't just expanding his empire. He was building something new. News of the healing cook at the McCrae Ranch had spread. Drifters, families who had lost their homes, people who were sick or broken started showing up at their gate. And Thorne and Juniper never turned anyone away. They offered food, medicine, and work. The ranch was no longer just a place for cattle. It was a sanctuary. But the past wasn't finished with them yet. One afternoon, a fine, expensive carriage rolled up the drive. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, his face cold and imperious. It was him, Eleanor's father, Mr. Vance. He had come himself. He didn't bring guards, just a lawyer. He wasn't here for a fight. He was here for a transaction. He saw the new life his daughter had built, the healthy child, the strong man by her side. He saw that his daughter, Eleanor, truly was gone, replaced by this resilient, powerful woman, Juniper. He offered them a deal. He would officially declare Eleanor Vance dead, leaving Juniper free forever. He would stop hunting them. In exchange, he demanded one thing, that the boy, his only grandchild, be sent back east to be raised as a proper Vance, heir to his fortune. He would never have to know his common mother. Juniper's blood ran cold. Thorne put a protective arm around her. "You want to buy your grandson?" Thorne asked, his voice laced with contempt. "You think everything has a price?" "Everything does," Vance said coolly. Juniper stepped forward. She looked her father in the eye, and for the first time in her life, she felt no fear, only pity. "My son is not for sale," she said, her voice like steel. "He will grow up here, under a big sky. He will know how to mend a fence, how to heal the sick, and how to be a good man. He will have a father who loves him, not a monster who owns him. He has something your money can never buy, a home. Now get off our land." For a long moment, Mr. Vance just stared at her, his perfect, composed facade beginning to crack. He saw the truth in her eyes. He had lost. He turned without another word, got back in his carriage and rode away, disappearing in a cloud of dust, a ghost returning to a haunted past. He was never seen in Texas again. Thorne pulled Juniper into his arms, kissing her deeply. The final threat was gone. They were truly free. That evening, Thorne finished carving a new sign to hang at the entrance to the ranch. He burned the letters into the wood with his own hands. It didn't say McCrae Ranch anymore. It said McCrae and Rose, a ranch of hope. He hung it as the sun set, the golden light making the letters glow. He walked back to the house where the lights were warm and welcoming. Inside, Juniper was rocking Sonny to sleep, humming a soft lullaby. The house was filled with the smell of baking bread and the sound of life. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood there together watching their son. "Spring came late," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But it came." She leaned back against him, her hand covering his. Outside, the wind whispered through the new leaves in the herb garden, carrying the promise of a long and peaceful summer. They had faced down poison, guns, and the ghosts of their past. They had taken a barren piece of land and a broken life and made them bloom. They had found that the rarest, most powerful healing doesn't come from herbs or remedies, but from the simple, stubborn courage to build a home in the heart of another. If this story of survival and second chances touched your heart, if you believe in the kind of love that's forged in a fire and built to last, then you've found your tribe. We tell stories about the ones who refuse to break, the healers, the fighters, and the quiet heroes of the wild frontier. Don't miss another tale of redemption and grit. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of story lovers who know that the greatest adventures are the ones that lead us home.